Good evening. I'm Father Nick Austin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Campion Hall in Oxford, and a very warm welcome as well to people who are joining us online for this talk by Mark Thompson on the real battle for free speech. And this talk is being hosted by Campion Hall here in Oxford, together with Stonyhurst College, the Jesuit College in Lancashire. And it's a pleasure to welcome several alumni from Stonyhurst in the audience today. Mark Thompson is well known as the Director General of the BBC from 2004 to 2012. He was Chief Executive of Channel 4, President and CEO of the New York Times Company from 2012 to 2020. And he's currently the chairman of the board of directors of Ancestry, the genealogy people. He's also he's co-chair of the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is very closely related to our topic today, which he co-chairs with the Filipino journalist and freedom advocate Maria Ressa. Mark is an alumnus of Stonyhurst College and of Merton College here in Oxford. And Mark, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to talk on this very important topic to do with freedom of speech for journalists and the threats to freedom of speech increasingly from authoritarian regimes in various parts of the world. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Father. Yes, before I start, I should just say just a couple of things about what's in my mind about Stonyhurst. I'm a patron of the Stonyhurst Association, and one of our goals is to make the education that's available at that school available to as broad a group of people as possible. But the two things I guess in my mind is one, the recent death of someone who's a little bit older than me, but actually, and probably you couldn't describe as a close friend, but someone I knew well, both firstly at the school and then at the BBC, Chris Wenner. And Chris Wenner, in many ways, I mean, in a much more modest way, also did a little bit of kind of interesting foreign reporting from war zones and the rest. Chris was a really courageous journalist in many theatres, East Timor famously, but also Chechnya and Sarajevo and elsewhere. And someone who connected with and became very close to the people he reported. So there's a version of reporting which is dispassionate, not engaged, not emotionally connected with its subject. Chris was the opposite of that. He in the end, was passionately caring about the stories he was reporting. And I just think of Chris Wenner, that kind of mixture of, he's a very larger-than-life character, at the school, by the way, as a teenager and throughout his life. The kind of mixture of adventure, kind of sheer boldness, and integrity, and that spirit of giving, not taking, doing journalism, I just think is very redolent of the kind of best kind of product of that school. I mean, there are kind of photographs and oil paintings of people like Chris Wenner at the school, sometimes with medals and things, and he's one of them. And I think I do associate that with the school. The other thing, which maybe is a little bit, I don't want to overclaim for this at all, but connected to the kind of things I'm going to talk about tonight and the kind of spot I've ended up in, is a kind of education which doesn't try to slice everything into separate subjects, each with its own little GCSE and A level and all the rest of it, but is an attempt to try and draw subjects together. I think, the Society of Jesus some years ago would have called this the Ratio Studiorum, and it's ultimately the Renaissance Humanities course, and it's the idea of taking mathematics and languages and history and science and rhetoric, very importantly rhetoric, and trying to understand them all together. Now, this is not the way the modern world thinks, but that kind of spirit reflected, those people who went to Stonyhurst will know, in the year group names and so on. The idea of a progression, a development of a young person's mind through exposure, but also connectivity between different things, I do associate with that school and with a particular Jesuit doctrine of education, which I think is significantly being lost more broadly and to our disbenefit. And the kind of things I'm going to, frankly, fairly loosely and relaxedly noodle through this afternoon, I hope you'll see one or two of those, the kind of the way in which, you know, it's possible to kind of connect things and to understand things better in relation to each other rather than regarding everything as its own specialist subject. So I'm going to talk a bit about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press today, and I'm going to try and relate it to really two things, one of which is a debate which is very lively in the United States and in the UK, to some extent in continental Europe as well. I know from French and German colleagues, it's particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, about the kind of boundaries of freedom of expression and, you know, real and supposed pressures on freedom of expression in context like, to pluck a random example, a great university. What does it feel like? How do you navigate all of that? And what does it mean? What's the kind of cultural meaning of what's going on? And then I'm going to talk a bit about something which is very different, which is the work that, as we've just heard, Maria Reza and I and others are just starting, which is essentially a new global attempt to try and figure out a way of supporting brave, independent, without fear or favour journalism around the world, and in particular in the global south. What can we do to support people who are fighting and, as you'll hear, significantly often dying to defend freedom of speech? And I'll, you know, without wanting to minimise what's happening in our universities and elsewhere in our societies, I will draw something of a contrast between the sacrifices and the risks run by people like my friend and colleague Maria Reza and some of the debates we're having in our prosperous Western countries. But I thought we might begin just by trying to get one or two pinpoints on what do we mean, and in a sense what do the rules say about freedom of expression. So I thought we'd begin with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This is a part of the Bill of Rights, which I think was ratified in 1791. So it's an addition, and a rather critical addition, to the actual Constitution itself of some years earlier. So the First Amendment reads like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is probably the single most important statement of freedom of expression anywhere. It's not the first. There are one or two earlier ones, but this is one, obviously, for a the formation of a major new country, and which has been influential, I think, probably on all other such expressions. I'll give you one more, which is from the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, we're moved from 1791 to, I think, 1953. Article 10 of the Convention, freedom of expression. Quote, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. The right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. Now, there's 4 or 5 more and some very important ones we could add, but let's live with these two as a kind of two pins in the map of freedom of expression. And let's just spend a little time trying to understand what's been said. I think there's the first really important, simple point to make, which is both of these expressions see freedom of expression as a right which is asserted specifically against a threat of interference by the government. It's a really elementary point. It's often talked about loosely as if the freedom of expression is a much more kind of broader, social contract between all of us. And, you can make that case. But actually, at the death, the framers of the Bill of Rights and the framers of the European Convention see the principal threat to freedom of expression being the civil authority, the government. And I think they're right. I think it's always been true. And in a sense, the risk of forgetting that and blurring it into other debates is you miss the very simple point that governments have a natural interest and tendency to want to suppress free speech. And given half a chance, they will find a way of beginning to do it. Interestingly enough, even democratic governments, one of the most important group of people who are protected by freedom of expression are minorities. And actually, a properly constituted majority democratic government can itself still find itself in various ways trying to suppress freedom of speech. And of course, we know around the world that we still live on a planet where many, many countries, including very big countries like China, aim to suppress freedom of expression essentially completely. So what I want to say is I take an extremely old-fashioned view that freedom of expression is best used as a right which we need to protect us from our governments, and which need to be defended against the natural tendencies of governments. The second thing is it's not just a right of the author or the speaker. It can often sound, freedom of expression can often sound like this is a rather indulgent gift that we give, extremists or perhaps artists who want to do some notably, obscene or exceptional piece of work, and they're kind of we say, well, we're a civilized society, we're going to let you do it. At its heart is the notion is the people have the right to listen, to hear, to watch, and to make up their own mind about what they think about things. So the government's not going to do it for you. You can make up your own mind. So it's the right to listen and read and hear every bit as much as, and I would argue almost more than it is the right to express yourself. It's the right of impression, if you like. The third thing is, and again, this is often not talked about, there's a very powerful doctrine which is explicit in US case law, and has been for many, many decades, about compelled speech. Now, I guess some people will know what I'm talking about, but this is the notion that the First Amendment absolutely includes the right not to be compelled to say something for the government or indeed anyone else. So you have the right not to publish. Again, in control societies, actually, the problem in control societies is not just the suppression of independent journalism and independent thought. It's also that the government forces people, and straightforwardly in China today, there are central propaganda departments which hand out headlines for newspapers, and the newspapers are compelled to report what the government wants them to report. So there is an absolute right not to publish. There's an absolute right not to have an invitation. I've been invited here to give a speech tonight. I don't have a right to be invited, and I can't really claim there's some universal right which says, well, I should have been invited by the Jesuits. They must be against me, or maybe they don't invite white men anymore. You can imagine cancel culture. We have a freedom not to publish. And that in its own way is as important as the freedom to publish. And I suppose what I want to say is, from that I take the principle that we don't have a right to be heard. We can certainly try and be heard, but we have no sort of there's nothing intrinsic which says, what I say must be heard by the entire world. And again, quite often there's a kind of premise in people's arguments that there is such a right. I mean, supposing I'm a assiduous follower of QAnon, and I feel I've come across irrefutable evidence that the Chiltern Railways and GWR and all the other train companies whose trains come through Oxford Station, that the management of these companies are not human beings but lizard people who are disguised as human beings. So this is obviously something the world needs to hear. I write a letter to the Times revealing my evidence and explaining this, and the letters editor of the Times refuses to print my letter. Is he breaking a freedom of expression rule by not printing my letter? We have an idea of editorial discretion, that the Times is not required to publish every letter it receives, and it can take perfectly sensible judgments about what it thinks are reasonable views or views that people as a whole would find interesting. To be fair, people probably would find my letter quite interesting, but you can see that we've actually got a whole set of conventions in our newspapers about what should and shouldn't be reasonably published. And that none of that is infringing the fundamental principles of freedom. I'm still, I'm entitled to email it to my friends. I'm entitled to, shout it from the rooftops, to write it on a poster and stick it on a tree outside my house. I mean, I can still publish. It doesn't mean I can publish it in the New York Times or do it on the BBC. Though I want to give you an example, which is... it's a BBC example, and there are exceptions to this principle. And the reason I want to say the example is I think it's really illustrative of a number of things about like freedom of expression in the real world. And by the way, what an incredibly unpopular thing freedom of expression can be. Again, another naive view is maybe this is, everyone wants freedom of expression, and therefore why should it be at risk? My experience is generally people are very eager that views they agree with should be heard. They're much less eager that views they don't agree with should be heard. Not everyone, but I think generally, actually, people have quite a biased view of freedom of expression. So, the BBC has separate but important obligations to political impartiality because of its extraordinarily broad reach and influence, because it occupies kind of precious and almost exclusionary spectrum, broadcast spectrum, and simply because politicians and the public have thought this should be the case, the BBC has very precise further obligations around, let's talk about share of voice and plurality of views, which are different concepts than of simple freedom of expression. So, for example, perhaps people will know that in elections, the BBC will have politicians on and literally will use a stopwatch to make sure that politicians from different parties get the same amount of time. Now, that doesn't apply outside elections, but there's still a real sense of that you need to be extremely mindful in the BBC that you're being fair in the allocation of access to the microphone for different political perspectives. And I want to take the example of the programme Question Time, which again I think most people will know is a regular, actually pretty big audience BBC One programme, which has a selection of politicians and sometimes a public intellectual or some other public figure who are asked questions by an invited audience. The audience is chosen by Mori and broadly represents voting intention across the United Kingdom. So it's not a parliament, but in some ways you've got what's meant to be a pretty representative group of the British public asking a range of different politicians questions. The Tories, Labour, Lib Dems are on most weeks, all three. Minor parties get on sometimes. The national parties, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Ulster parties, the Greens, Scottish Socialists have been on occasion, and so on. So in 2009, the editor of Question Time and the head of news came to me and said, we think we need to have the head of the British National Party on Question Time. The BNP had won some elections. They'd hit the same test parameters of voters and successful elections, local elections and European elections as other minor parties. And the criteria said that the BNP is a legally constituted party. They were putting up candidates for election at all levels, European, national and local. You should have Nick Griffin, the leader of the BNP, on Question Time. And I said, we went through it, I asked a number of questions, but I thought their logic was correct. So we announced that Nick Griffin was going to be on Question Time. Well, I mean, essentially, there was a kind of minor sort of a tactical nuclear weapon went off. The decision was initially criticised by all the main parties, Tories, Labour and Lib Dems. Initially, the three main parties said, we won't actually take part in this programme. It is so heinous to have a racist like Nick Griffin. Mr. Griffin would deny he was a racist. Many people believe he is. And I'm not going to contradict them on that, knowing his history. But we won't even appear. Eventually, they decided to front actually very strong candidates. And the brilliant commentator and writer Bonnie Greer, African-American woman writer Bonnie Greer, also took part in the panel. It was a very strong panel. There was an attempt to prosecute me, I can't remember quite what for, but there was an attempt to prosecute me on the night of the recording. There were a number of thousands of demonstrators, police on horseback and all the rest of it outside Television Centre, and indeed people rather brilliantly invaded Television Centre and the studio and all the rest of it. We actually did the programme. I'd been reliably assured by some of the most eminent politicians, because I've got phone calls from many politicians, that putting Nick Griffin and the BNP on Question Time would lead to a massive spike in support for the BNP. Massive, oxygen of publicity would be one of the phrases you'd use for the BNP. And, we would potentially change British politics for the worse forever. What actually happened is he gave a poor account of himself. Everyone else, it must be said, ganged up on him. The BNP over the next 12 months sank without trace, and Mr. Griffin lost his job as leader of the BNP, about a year or so later. So the predictions of what letting the British public hear the BNP, what they would do, turned out to be completely wrong. But I guess my point is that I think the BBC, by the way, it's very straightforward. And by the way, a lot of people who'd said we were wrong to put him on the air afterwards came up, and in that rather brilliant way politicians do, said, well, we knew you had to do it. We knew you had to do it, but you'll understand why we had to make a fuss about it. What I like about this example is, firstly, it's got that slightly grim quality, which many of the classic cases of freedom of expression have, where the battle of principle on the First Amendment is won on behalf of Larry Flynt and Hustler magazine for how extreme the pornography can be, or the right of the American Nazi Party to march in their regalia through a small American town. Those are both classic cases. It's pretty unpopular stuff. An awful lot of good people honestly think you're doing the wrong thing by saying, actually, they are a party. It's not really for us to have a beauty contest where senior BBC leaders decide which parties they like and which ones they don't like, which is really the alternative. And if you want to prescribe the BNP, if you think the BNP is so heinous it shouldn't exist, Parliament should prescribe it. You can't ask the BBC to do the prescribing of political parties. But it's like that. That's what freedom of expression arguments, in my experience, are like. They're rather unlovely in terms of the things being defended in our Western societies. Say many good people, honestly, I think for rather confused reasons, end up being on the side of censorship of one sort or another rather than on genuine freedom of expression. That's what they're like. And what I want to say is, I want to compare that with the kind of conversation we're having now in the realm, in particular, of culture wars. and which is often, again, described as freedom of expression. Now, I think there are some things that we can see in common with the question time example. The view that what's at stake is freedom of expression, I would say no. What's at stake is some version of that idea of breadth of opinion, plurality of voice. How wide should the discussions be on a given topic? And what views are beyond the pale? What speakers are beyond the pale? Now, most of us, I think, would accept some speakers are beyond the pale. And honestly, if Oxford University was doing a seminar or a session like this on conspiracy theories, and I, with my theory about Chiltern Railways and lizard people, said, I've got to be represented here. I can tell the truth about this conspiracy. I can put everyone right about this. Just let me on the panel, and I'll spout my views. And by the way, a very distinguished BBC former colleague, David Icke, has written books on this subject, and often invites people to come and hear him talking about lizard people. These people exist, and if you ask the British public, like the American public, how many members of the public support theories about lizard people, you would be, I would say, surprised and possibly dismayed by the results. 10, 15, 20% will say, you can't rule this stuff out. Realistically, Oxford is probably going to say, actually, Mark, despite your distinguished Jesuit education and your media career, we still don't want to hear you on lizard people. And although I will definitely go out and protest and say this is typical of the mainstream media and our woke universities, they are trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. I mean, we know the patter. We know how it's not really about that. It's actually what I'm doing is I'm lobbying and jostling for attention. And I will use almost any excuse I can to get it. And I want to say, I think that's in a democracy, that's what everyone does. Politicians do it, pressure groups do it. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. In many ways, I think the way you find, where the line should live, what is the convention? How do you treat some essentially new issue? And the boundaries of sensitivity and caring and mutual respect between trans activists and radical feminists, or between where you do that, it's probably there's no alternative to fighting it out and in a sense having the debate and maybe different fora taking different views and ultimately over time some kind of consensus or truce or working agreement emerging. I don't see how you avoid that. And in a way, at a time of cultural and social dislocation and questions of new rights and essentially, new topics and new disagreements coming up all the time, you'd expect these arguments. I mean, the arguments began with, should women have the vote? And we have a century of vituperation and disagreement and people storming out of meetings and storming back in again. I mean, that's what democracies are like. What I want to say two things. Firstly, I distinguish between the slightly chilly world of thinking the BNP, we better let them appear because in the end, that's what a strict definition of our duty requires of us. And the lobbying for your point of view, for the people you back, and your battle to try and get them a bit more time at the microphone. Not to criticise it, and not to in any way say that people shouldn't do that, but let's call it what it is. Another example, by the way, one lives with, particularly again even to this day at the BBC, a climate scientist and a climate skeptic, Lord Lawson, has often been noted in dispatches for these things. The climate scientist doesn't want to debate with climate skeptics, doesn't think they've got any legitimacy. the climate skeptic points to still a minority, but a significant number of people who, like him or her, are very dubious about the climate change scientific claims, but also maybe about the governmental or other policy proposals behind them. How much time should climate skeptics get on the BBC? That is a battle. But it's a battle where broadly the climate emergency scientists and their supporters are on one side of who should get the mic, and the climate skeptics are on the other. And it's got the quality of a political battle between two groups. Now, many people, I think I'm probably one of them, would say science is different, and the special legitimacy of science means that actually, there is a reason why we give doctors and scientists who talk about the dangers of smoking like 900 times more airtime than people who say, I don't think cigarettes do you any harm at all. So over time, there's a massive tilt towards science and medicine on that rather than to individuals. Climate is overwhelmingly now on the BBC, at the New York Times and elsewhere. It's the climate emergency, the scientists and the activists who are getting airtime. Climate skepticism is heard occasionally and probably should be heard occasionally, but that's a good example of a kind of disputed territory. So, with that in mind, and recognising that people genuinely believe that, look, in our democracies, fundamental freedom of expression is sorted out. That's okay. Now we can move on to these rather more sophisticated questions of plurality and what is the duty of a university in terms of young people and the breadth of opinion. We come to the government's bill. I live in America, but even over there we've heard about the higher education brackets freedom of speech bill. So the higher education freedom of speech bill, which I think should be renamed, I don't think it's freedom of speech, I think it's actually plurality of voice bill, or possibly, frankly, the higher education brackets more conservative voices please bill, is an attempt by the UK government to regulate, essentially via one of the bodies, both universities and student unions about the limits to which they can choose who they have on panels. And at least in principle, they will be fined or can be fined if by the freedom of speech champion, freedom of speech czar, appointed by an ombudsman for freedom of speech, they're thought to have not been free enough with speech. Now, to me, every bit of this is wrong. I mean, firstly, as the Chancellor of this university, Chris Patton's pointed out, the idea of a freedom of speech government czar. I mean, George Orwell, should be... Well, actually, George would probably be cursing himself for not having thought of that for 1984. It's completely brilliant. The idea the government has a kind of champion or czar to enforce freedom of speech is an astonishing upside-down view of the world, to me at least. They're more or less the last people I would try. Any government, this is not a political point, any government, even if they start off with good intentions, they may well start off with good intentions, where does that end? When you've given a bureaucrat of some shape the right to decide who can and can't appear in front of a body of students. And what happened to freedom of association and assembly? The right of the people to gather, in the way they want to and to choose themselves. And what I want to say is, as it happens, I would say, firstly, my first instinct is, back to the ratio studiorum, the broadest possible exposure to views, including contrary views and perspectives and lives that young people, in fact, for that matter, frankly, middle-aged and old people are exposed to, the better for democracy, the better for our chances of understanding each other. So my basic bias would be, actually, I would love, this university and all the other universities to lean in as far as they think they can. We all know there are limits. And in the end, although, some universities and some groups might draw the limits narrower than I would, they have the right to do that. they have the right to do that. And if I don't like it, I can complain about it and make a big fuss about it, as any number of cultural pessimists do in columns all over the Western press. So, there are lots of, kind of ways of making a meal of it if you want to. And I think, by the way, many of those critics underestimate something, as it happens, I personally profoundly believe, which is the idea, which is sometimes sneered at, that minorities, they could be ethnic minorities, they could be other minorities like trans people and their families and friends, could feel hurt and upset and frightened by speakers at a university. I would say I know, have worked with, and have listened to enough minorities who feel that to believe that's true, and the issue of not lightly or casually taking that for granted and just in a way battering the door down with broad freedom of expression arguments, I think is really well taken. I think we have to be careful about assuming that people who, as it were, have more skin in the game, have more life experience and more pain and suffering because of what's happened to them, these issues can be different for them than they are for us. And we have to be humble, I think, in the face of that. I still believe there's a way through with all of that. Absolutely a way through. But the idea that this kind of mechanism, which I take to be essentially an intrusion into one aspect of freedom of expression, far from a defense of it, I think is exactly the wrong way. And it's the classic example of the kind of intervention. It's a medicine which is almost certainly worse than the disease it seeks to cure. And unfortunately, it's not alone. Online harms, counter-extremism tactics in terms of the internet, hate speech, incitement to religious and racial hatred. Most Western governments, not the Americans, the First Amendment won't let it do it, but the European Convention has got quite a lot of weasel words about, reasons of state whereby countries might want to, perhaps make things not quite as free as it says on the tin. Most Western governments are looking at ways of excluding more things from this realm of the free, always with some, arguable reason. And their taste, I think, is moving towards legislation in many areas of our life. So the mood music about freedom of expression in Western democracies, generally, I think with fairly well-intentioned politicians behind it, is to tighten things up. The internet's gone too far, we've lost control, maybe culture wars are partly because of that, the young people are out of hand, let's just tighten the screws a bit in the interests of, public tranquility, reduction of extremism, and so on. So I would say that we're going through a period where things are getting tougher. And more broadly, the pressures, the national security state after 9/11 in America, tougher environment for reporters, I tell you straightforwardly. People thought Donald Trump would be the worst president. Actually, he was no worse than Barack Obama. He was probably the worst president of the last century in terms of steps against journalists and whistleblowers. The worst president for freedom of speech in American history is Abraham Lincoln, but that's another story. So quite a bleak time in America, and I would say in the UK and in continental Europe, things are bad there. So briefly, let me just turn to what is going on in the rest of the world, and in a sense what Maria and I and the International Fund for Public Interest Media is about. Let me start with Maria. Maria's a very experienced journalist. She was a CNN bureau chief in Asia. She was very prominent in Filipino television journalism. Some years ago, she founded a digital news organization, Rappler, which does accountability and investigative journalism, in particular looking at the regime of President Duterte and its conduct in the Philippines. And the president has conducted a systematic campaign against Rappler and against Maria. She's been found guilty of cyber libel. That's an example of a fresh new law, which I think is code for reporting in, as it were, disobliging ways about the Filipino government. Cyber libel, 6 years sentence. She's appealing that at the moment. She's got 5 or 6 other incoming criminal charges. She's in the United States at the moment, but she has to get permission from 6 or 7 different courts to leave the Philippines. And it's by no means clear what will happen when she goes back to the Philippines at the end of this month. Rappler is also, as in many, many countries in Latin America, sometimes in Africa and across Asia, advertising is weaponized, and state advertising is only given to friendly rather than objective news organizations, and other powerful interests in these societies are also encouraged to direct advertising at favored rather than disfavored advertising sources. I saw Maria last Monday at Harvard, and she told me that over 20 Filipino journalists have been murdered since Duterte came to power. The 21st or 22nd was killed the weekend before last. Maria, of course, is getting more or less daily death threats, and the whole social media campaign of vilification against her. The Russian editor who won the Nobel Peace Prize with her a few weeks ago has had 6 reporters in Russia murdered, 6, including some really notable and prominent reporters. And I could tell this story about 10 other countries. So what are we going to do about it? Well, there are some great organizations already trying to do what they can, and it's not much, about journalism safety and about the organizing of legal defense and funding of legal defense for people like Maria Reza. The idea of the International Fund is to get a really quite big fund together to essentially provide economic support for independent news organizations across the global south. We might ultimately end up doing it in other countries as well, Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe, for example. And the notion is really of enough money to keep these guys going to the point where they can grow their audience and at least fend off the economic pressures that are put on them by political enemies, to the point where there is some commercial revenue coming in, and they're beginning to get to the point where some of the development banks we want to partner with can then potentially lend the money to get on to the next stage. So the plan is donors from governments, from the private sector and foundations, but a fund which is genuinely multilateral, which does not as a sense, just do what its donor says. It's got its own objective ways of deciding where the money should go and tracking how it's used, and with experts on every continent who are helping us make the right choices. We don't have very much money yet, but I've been rushing around the world trying to put that right in recent days, and I'm going to be quite busy for the next few weeks to try and we have a few million at the moment. I have to say we would like to have more than $50 million ready to go by the time we get to Christmas, but let's see how we do. But this is one piece of the jigsaw, and we would be the first to say Maria's living this, and I've already spoken to 10, 15, 20 people, and over the years on the ground, I've seen these brilliant, brave journalists and entrepreneurs on the ground with courage that makes one feel incredibly humble in their presence, and who are taking risks that we just don't take in our lives. And we want to support them. And I would say to everyone, there's many ways you can support this effort. You can support it by potentially giving us money, or helping to support individual journalists in countries where you hear about them and where they either need funds or support, or their cases and causes need publicity. And you can support more broadly the freedom of expression, which broadly, I would say, is in trouble almost everywhere, going a little bit backwards almost everywhere. You can do that by what you say, what you do, and sometimes by your forbearance, actually, in settings which are much closer to home. So I think where I want to leave it is this. What I've tried to say tonight is, firstly, freedom of expression is principally a right that citizens like us and citizens all over the world either do or should enjoy, and the principal protection it confers is against the government saying what we can and can't hear, do and say and speak. Secondly, let's distinguish between important, but in my view, somewhat separate issues about the boundaries of appropriate or civilized debate in different contexts, for example, our universities. And let's not blur the two and use what I think of as often the life and death issues of freedom of expression as a cover for other kinds of interference in freedom. Thirdly, freedom of expression, which I think a few years ago it felt like it was solved, and that there was a kind of manifest destiny where it was going to spread around the world. It's going backwards. It's going backwards really badly. And the people we're talking to in the Global South were doing better 5 years ago than they are now. And the world's strong men, I would say strong women, but in fact they are all men, are getting bolder. Donald Trump, I'm afraid, the Trump's attack on the press in America was music to the ears of many, many leaders in other parts of the world who thought, if they can do it in America, if you can demonize the press, the enemies of the people in America, why should we restrain ourselves? So things have got really dark in many parts of the world, but there are very brave people prepared to stand up and be counted on this issue, and we can do something to help them. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I've very much enjoyed the way you were straightforward and bold and clarifying on the things that could be seen that we might overly complexify, but then more nuanced about where there are difficult waters to be steered through. And that contrast between the situation that we have here, for example, in the UK and places in the world where journalists really do put their life on the line, that was a helpful clarification. I'm going to invite questions and comments from the audience here. If you're online, you're very welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll also include some of your questions as well. So, first question, thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, but also all that you're doing, which is obviously extremely important and urgent work. The trajectory of your talk moved from the idea of, it culminated with what the real threat to freedom of speech was, implying that along the way that there was a kind of phantom threat, or that the threat was by degrees of calibration less serious, and so we can look at what's going on in universities and we may worry or we may not worry by degrees, but really the sharp end of it, in the global south, people are dying and so on. And I'm sure that's right in the context of thinking about the ways in which free expression might be curtailed or circumscribed or punished, and the degrees of severity of that. When we think of the curtailment of freedom of speech as something that's external, for which one is punished or one is inhibited from participating in. I wanted to ask you a question hitting the three notes that you did of your understanding of a Jesuit education, universities and the press from a different angle, which is the constraint of speech, which comes with a kind of a peremptory closing off of other views in our polarized world where we imagine there's a kind of binary right and a wrong and a tribalism. And I, in particular, if we imagine a Stonyhurst pupil, for example, going up to one of our great universities and they have a view about pro-life, or they've domesticated a view of the theology of the body, and they come against certain kinds of transactivism. Or indeed, you mentioned science as the most obvious example of one we couldn't countermand. Hilaire Belloc has an essay at the beginning of the 20th century in which he warns us against exactly this. He says that science, the name science, is used like the name of a tribal god. Once used, all discussion ended. And I think in the context of what we've seen with COVID, where we're told endlessly to follow the science in clearly political ways, it's a very dangerous way to go down.
Yeah.
And so my worry, just to sharpen the question, is to say, what do you have to say? Do you still see a trajectory of increasingly greater seriousness as we move towards the global south, or do you see that the journalists are educated at universities where there is a significant bias and that this may be at odds with the very thing that you valorize within a Stonyhurst education?
So what a fantastic question, because it's like, to me, it's like, you know, that opens up the entire. So I'm not sure it's possible to give a completely simple, straight answer to the question, but I'll try and come at your question in several ways. So firstly, I want to say, it's as it happens. I think, as it were, what happens to our culture, and does it flourish? Does the kind of the view that young people are exposed to, does it broadly expand and get richer, or does it narrow because of, I don't like the phrase myself, but political correctness and a sort of so look, I want to say I don't think that's a trivial issue. I don't want to confuse that, frankly, endless debate. We'll find in the literature, classical Greek, Athens, people arguing very similar points. The young people of today, the sophists, and as opposed to true understanding, and episteme versus doxa is a sort of that sort of perennial debate is not a new one, and it's appropriate, particularly in the academy, for that debate to happen. I sort of feel the practitioners in the debate and the participants in the debate have broadly the tools to conduct the debate. There is not, partly for the debate is to some extent interminable, literally interminable, because people are starting from such different premises that it's almost impossible to resolve them. But that kind of activity of fussing away and endlessly arguing about these things, I take to be a broadly, one, inevitable, two, actually itself pretty healthy. The kind of end of Western civilization in the university, Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind is 1987. We've for half a century been told the jig is up. It's like they're learning nothing. You can't question any number of kind of liberal biases, but I do sometimes feel there are people who are discovering that our universities are stuffed full of lefties, as if this is some astonishing new who knew sort of thing. I always feel my college Merck was founded by members of the Social Worker Party dressed as monks. They've always been like that. So I just don't want to confuse that with the kind of slightly scary, simple world of, can you write the truth about what's happening in your society? And I don't think the rot's got so far. And I absolutely see, by the way, the personal tragedies of individual careers which were ended because of particular incidents, we read about them. And, everyone's got a little cultural pessimist inside, who pops up and says, it's all part of a bigger, I want to say I'm a bit sceptical about cultural pessimism as a sort of which is a universal explanation for everything that's bad in the world, and it's very satisfying. It's very enjoyable, cultural pessimism in its own dark way. I'm quite sceptical about whether that helps us very much. I do think that the deliberate and to some extent political attempt to describe what's happening in terms of the limits to free debate in certain contexts in British and American universities as a kind of an attack on freedom of speech is an overclaim. So it's not that this area is not as important. It's really, I think it's a different set of questions, and they're far more familiar, I think, than it's often presented to us that there is something new happening. It's not new. I mean, and Hilaire Belloc's point is very well taken, that some scientists were overreaching and trying to apply science to theology, for example. I mean, if you're a great biologist, a great Darwinian biologist like Richard Dawkins, that gives you about as much authority, really, to talk about theology as being a milkman, in my view. I mean, it doesn't do any harm, but it's not really relevant. That kind of overreach is an issue. And the other point you raise, which is very interesting, and it's a problem, and actually I wrote a book about rhetoric a few years ago, and you cannot escape the fact that the public policy decisions which flow from science are political. And it is incredibly hard to, and to be fair to them, I mean, I don't think they did a particularly good job, but it's really hard in real time, kind of with live ammunition, to keep dispassionate and to some extent kind of interim scientific research and public policy debate and conclusions about what to do in the light of that research entirely segregated in your discourse. And once they start blurring, you're sort of lost. And the danger also, you just get a kind of shambles where, we haven't got enough masks to give everyone, then gets reverse engineered into, most people don't need masks. So you get all sorts of kind of just messy, fundamentally mistakes and all of that. I think I'm done now.
Yeah, great, thanks. Would anyone else like to ask a question? And then we'll see if anyone from online has something to add. Yep.
Hi, thanks very much for that. I think I speak for everyone when I say that you answered a lot of questions about freedom of speech I didn't even know I had. So I do medicine, so forgive me from coming back to the kind of scientific debate issue. But I was wondering about what you thought about with kind of scientific communication, and when you're trying to get it across to the public, how you deal with the problem that arises between having to simplify something that has, as with any issue I suppose, but has like kind of deep research that not everyone can understand in a bite-sized moment, and how you kind of resolve that with people having other views that might objectively not be true but are more easily digestible. I was wondering how you thought scientists should go about presenting information objectively, so obviously people are free to make up their own decisions, but also kind of have to make it palatable, if that makes sense.
No, well, I think it's really interesting, and I think actually over the course of the pandemic, I think we've seen some really good medical and scientific communicators emerge. I think that's, kind of like serious media broadcasters, both sides of the Atlantic, and serious newspapers have actually tried quite hard to find people, particularly in an area which is, kind of sort of social science, stroke science, epidemiology, and statistics, really. And I think that it's not, but still, it's very hard to do. Statistics and probability are probably actually the hardest. They're the most kind of regularly important and relevant, and some of the hardest things to convey to people who simply don't think about these things, and frankly, have been spat out from our school systems sometimes with an imperfect grasp of standard deviations and all the rest of it. So I think, firstly, over time in COVID, I think it got better. I think, for what it's worth, I think the biggest fault, both from politicians and senior public scientists talking about COVID, and for many years climate change, was not trusting the public. And I think, in a funny way, telling the truth and not trying to overstate scientific certainty. I think it would have been much, much better if, for the first 6 months of COVID, there'd been much, much more emphasis on the fact that we didn't know very much, and that a lot of what people were being told was very much on the basis of the best information and the best, as it were, hypothetical understanding that we had, and was likely to change. And I think that the risk that you try and move too quickly to certainty in the belief that public can't be trusted with uncertainty, I think people are quite sophisticated. And actually, you can see over time trust between the British government and the British public growing both ways. And the public listening and the government, and the public beginning to get to the point where, by and large, if they ask for a lockdown, the public will accept it. If they ask to wear masks, of course, there'll always be some people who are not convinced. But actually, I think it's honesty and clarity and it's not really because people need to understand receptors or different kinds of there's circulating antigens, but there's other kinds of body response, and you can't just assume that a certain amount of circulating antigens means this. That stuff, if people want to find it, they can. But the simple things about how do you keep yourself safe, what do we know now, how soon will we know the next bit, that's the way I think about it, really. And it's actually, I think it's human communication. It's not really, I think sometimes scientists hide behind the complexity of their work, just think, well, I can't explain any of it.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll ask Joe now to ask a question from our online viewers.
Right, greetings. There's about 70 people currently watching, and we got near 100 at the peak of your talk. I don't think they ran away, but I think Q&A is... there are some great questions, though, and I'll try to clump them together if I could. Maybe one 3-part question. What are the dangers and risks of free speech? Another question asks, is there something in the water about misinformation that compromises people's freedom of speech and making up one's mind? Maybe I can just let you answer those two so I don't overwhelm you now. So attendant risks of free speech?
The danger of free speech is people will say what they think, really. And that they will lie to each other and be hateful to each other. So it's that they'll be human, really, and they'll do all the things human beings do. And I think it's really important to say that freedom of speech, I'm afraid, is the freedom to lie. Now there are, I think, appropriately legal remedies. If quite possibly Chiltern Railway could sue me for defaming them. From what I said tonight, so there are some reasonable limits against harm. But to me, the point about misinformation, the world is full of misinformation, and it always has been. Read the rumour at the start of Henry IV Part 2. If you remember the Battle of Shrewsbury is misreported as having been won by Hotspur. In fact, it's lost and he's dead. But it's really the speech that rumour gives is really about how rumours are much more effective than honest information. You always hear the rumours first. So misinformation is one of the ways as a species that we behave. I accept there's been quite interesting questions about how that gets mechanised by and accelerated by social media. But I think the thing about freedom of speech is it is Pandora's box. There's no question it is that thing, which is why governments think, wouldn't everything run more smoothly if we just shut the box and then we can get on and build a happy and healthy society? That's the puzzle, I think. But if you believe in democracy, you really have to believe in freedom of speech. That's the oxygen on which democracy works.
I suppose then, following up from that, is there something external to journalism or external to freedom of expression that would sort of form kind of a moral community so that we can check one another other than just shouting louder or finding a new tactic to kind of outdo?
That's such an interesting and important question. Of course, I think we sort of call that civilization, really. In other words, that freedom of speech needs to happen in a context. I don't want to be too sort of kind of simplistic about it, but if we think about the agora, the marketplace for ideas, I think the kind of design of the agora and the kind of communities within that group and the role of conventional behaviour. An obvious example kind of really boring, an obvious example is parliamentary rules of discourse, you know, in the House of Commons, or, you know, in and it's you know, the thing about, you know, politeness and not calling each other liars on the floor of the House of Commons is not, as it were, it's not because we're all nice people. It's really that to get a parliament to work efficiently, you don't want the debate to descend into vituperation. And famously, you know, leaving your kind of weapons outside is the most practical basis. It would be better if the members of parliament don't actually try and hack each other to death in the middle of the debate because they get angry. So it's like what civilizations do is they figure out a kind of modus vivendi where there probably are some conventional limits to what you can actually say to each other in terms of freedom of speech. They're not absolute, but they make everything go better. And that depends on all sorts of things. And I think that communities of different kinds and traditions can be really important in that. And I think traditions which are often sneered at, I mean, the biggest issue is the undermining of the idea of convention and tradition as basically being, you know, sort of anti-democratic, probably created, and they were, by the way, often created by power elites and therefore prejudicial to minorities. And there's some sort of thing, if you don't like these traditions, well, come up some other ones. But without conventions and traditions, freedom of speech is a wild thing. That's definitely true.
I could ask more from here, but if anyone has any questions in the room. One of the questions, I suppose...
Perhaps this could be our final question.
Final question, then. There's been a lot of greetings from Old Stonyhurst and Thailand and Newfoundland and elsewhere, and people calling even from in the house here. The last one, why do you think we are seeing the tightening up by authority around the world now? What do you think is behind it? Is this a new dynamic or just authority fearing challenge?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, so I think that the kind of, I mean, it's not really fair to Fukuyama, but the post-Berlin Wall notion that history was over and liberal democracy had basically won, and it was only a question of time before our broad values, our kind of mid-20th century version of a liberal democracy, capitalist democracy, kind of spread everywhere. And there were, in addition to the Berlin Wall, there was, and the West winning the Cold War, there was also manifest liberalisation in Latin America. People could point to different parts of the world, some countries in Southeast Asia, and say, it's moving one way. The game, you know, okay, the whistle hasn't gone, but basically the game's over and we won, and freedom of speech won. That, I mean, history doesn't seem to work like that, really. Stuff happens, you know. And so the first thing is, I think an idea of modern idea about progress got found out, and actually the messiness of the real world came out. We have now some highly successful, in some respects, culturally and economically expansionary, maybe not geographically expansionary, powers, I'm thinking principally of China, who are very hostile to freedom of speech, but have money to spend everywhere, are very influential, and by the way, are trying to use their economic clout to silence and weaken critics outside China. They will come after you wherever you are. And so there are, and we have other straightforward malign actors like Russia, who are trying to disrupt and undermine the way we do democracy and free speech, and to use it against us. So there's some straightforward, spiteful, malign actors, and there are some, if you like, globally ideological, hostile powers who are trying to do the opposite of what I've been talking about today. And secondly, the world is going through a period of disruption. We've lost the stability of the Cold War and the kind of lining up of nations in very big blocks. And mass population migration, the impact of globalization and digitization, and the beginnings now also of climate disruption, not to mention the shock of the financial crisis of 2008-9 and the pandemic, means that it's a tricky old period in the world. And the thing about authoritarianism is in many, many countries, there is a really significant popular support for these people. These are not people, it's not a kind of coup d'etat where a couple of, in most countries, in some countries they still do coup d'etat, but in many cases these are popular movements which are enough is enough, we need some clarity, we need some strength in government. And part of that is in a tradition which goes back to the fascist dictators of the 1930s, taking on what Hitler used to call the lying press. And getting rid of or shutting up the lying press becomes part of a package which you can see playing out with strong men of the left as well as the right around the world.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Mark. I think one thing that I'm taking away from this is you've explained so clearly how freedom of expression, freedom of speech isn't just a kind of libertarian right that I have the right to say what I want, but really is a public interest question, a matter of the common good, essential for the health of our democracies. You've also turned our minds, I think, to sort of challenge to support journalists in places where freedom of speech is severely under threat and they are putting their lives at risk. And we wish you all the best with your work with the Global Fund for Public Interest Media. And perhaps we can be a little bit challenged ourselves about how we can support such initiatives. Just on a personal note, Mark was explaining to me just before this a few of the places he'd been in the last couple of weeks, and it was a pretty intimidating itinerary, including across the pond in Boston and New York and so on. Very, very fully engaged a couple of weeks for you, and you've still managed to come here and speak so cogently to us today about a matter that concerns us all. So sincere thanks for being with us, and thank you to all those who've joined us, both here in Campion Hall, Oxford, the Jesuit Hall in the University of Oxford, and all those who've joined us online, especially members of Stonyhurst College and alumni of Stonyhurst College. It's been very good to have you with us. But thanks again, Mark, for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Good.